Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Utopian Horizons, a podcast about utopias real and imaginary. Interspersed with my normal interview episodes, I've been doing these solo episodes where I work my way through the novels of Philip K. Dick. This is one of those episodes, and it is about the novel Martian Time-Slip. Before we got into that book, something which I can't believe I forgot to do in the last episode was talk about Ursula Le Guin, who you may be aware passed away recently. I just wanted to talk a little bit about her because I think she's such an incredible writer and thinker when it comes to the subject of utopia. Someone who wrote about the subject in non-fiction and also very explicitly explored that subject in her fiction. I must say I haven't actually read a great number of her novels, so that's something that I'll need to remedy. But there will be an episode coming up on The Dispossessed. That's something that I've had planned for a while. I've got a guest for it, but it's just something that's going to happen later this year. I'm not quite sure when yet, but that is coming. But yeah, there's so many great quotes from Ursula Le Guin about Utopia, which I've got a couple here, of course. So she said, "The exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary." Which is something which I think is very relevant to a lot of things we've been talking about in this podcast, particularly in terms of the power of fiction, utopian fiction, and what that can do. Another one of her great quotes: "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So do the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." That's something we've talked about a lot in the podcast as well, this inability to think outside the terms of the system that we're in, the difficulty of doing that, our inability to kind of see the contingencies that led us to the place that we're at, and reminding us that those things are contingent and that those things can be changed. So anyway, yeah, I just wanted to touch briefly on Ursula Le Guin because she was such a great utopian, such a great writer, and I'd highly recommend you have a look at some of her novels if you're not familiar with her. Another thing I quickly wanted to touch on, I briefly mentioned before, I'm not sure when, a few episodes ago maybe, that I was thinking about maybe it'd be cool to get up a website and have a forum on there or something so people could come and talk about Utopia and talk about ideas for episodes and stuff like that. Troy very kindly sent me an email with lots of helpful feedback and mentioned that it might be a good idea to do like a Slack or a Discord instead, which I think is quite a good idea. I don't know, it might be fun. So I just want to say, if you think that getting in on a Discord or Slack to talk with me and other people about Utopia and stuff like that would be fun, then let me know if you think it's a good idea and then I'll do it. Also, I haven't really used either Discord or Slack, so I don't really know much about them, so I don't really have an idea of which one would be better for this purpose. So if you have an opinion on that, which one you would prefer, then again, that would be helpful to know. Yeah, so on to Martian Time-Slip. Martian Time-Slip was published in 1964. There were two other novels published that year by Philip K. Dick, The Simulacra and Clans of the Alpha Moon. So obviously they will be coming next in terms of Philip K. Dick episodes. And again, shows you how prolific he was. Looking at this, I think I saw that he wrote like 4 or 5 novels in 1 year around this time. So just insanely productive. So anyway, the book takes place in a colony on Mars. The protagonist is a repairman called Jack Bolan, who has suffered with schizophrenia in the past. He is free of that at the moment when we start the novel. He becomes involved with Arnie Cott, who's a mafia-like union leader, perhaps a more reactionary depiction of the institution of the union than you might expect from Philip K. Dick, but there we go. And it kind of revolves around this guy's plot to use an autistic boy called Manfred's possible ability to see the future. The theory within the book being that autistic people experience time differently and therefore this child may be able to see the future. I've picked out just a few things about the book that I think are interesting to talk about, and hopefully that means I can keep this one shorter than the last one, which perhaps the last Philip K. Dick episode, which perhaps went on for too long, but we'll see. So the first thing I want to touch on was the colony, which is something we also talked about in Man in the High Castle, but in this case I'm talking about it in a completely different way. I'm talking about in terms of the idea of establishing utopia somewhere else. So in the past, if you think about the original Utopia, Thomas More's Utopia, this would usually be an island. Think of also like Aldous Huxley's novel Island. It's somewhere isolated and undiscovered where you can establish utopia. In the era of sci-fi, that's typically another planet or a moon or whatever. Now, one thing this can do, this can perform the function of us allowing to experiment with different ideas unencumbered by the system that we live in, the way that works. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's disconnected from that system. And indeed, I think if it's properly a utopia, it will inherently be linked to that system. It will be a way of thinking about the problems of that system, a way of critiquing it, a way of providing possible solutions. However, it, I think, can also be a kind of escape. So this idea that we can escape from our problems and create an isolated utopia, find somewhere perfect to escape to. And you find that in the idea of space colonization, the idea that Earth is screwed basically, so we will have to begin somewhere else, the kind of defeatist way of thinking. I also see it as kind of tied up with this idea of like technological solutions to climate change, the idea that we can just keep going as we are and science will somehow solve the problem by geoengineering, putting iron filings in the sea or something like that, and we can just keep going as we are. We don't have to do anything, and science will solve our problems for us. I see it's kind of tied up in a way. I'll return to that in a minute, but I think there's probably an element of that escapism in Golden Age science fiction, which admittedly I'm not particularly knowledgeable about, so that may be unfair. But anyway, this adventurous genre of fiction, this idea of visiting wondrous places that kind of escapes from our world and the problems that we have to face. Now, Philip K. Dick's Space Colonies, in this book and in general, if you think of something like The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, which we will get to in a future episode, they do not do that. The colony is not an escape. So Mars here in Martian Time-Slip is unpleasant. It's a harsh, difficult place to live. When Jack's wife looks out the window near the beginning of the novel, she talks about the harsh light. She talks about using her good Earth-made coffee pots, implying that the standard of stuff on Mars is not as good. The water is described as unpleasant and tainted. The air is cold and choked with fine sand. The most difficult thing about this off-world colony is the scarcity of water. So again, early in the book, Sylvia's talking about how they've waited 11 days for their share of water from the Great Ditch. And her neighbours, the Steiners, come out begging not to have the water turned off. And she says that each drop of water dominates their life. And there's this idea everyone's reduced to pettiness, bickering, tension. Something that Philip K. Dick's quite good at, I think, representing how the pressure of the system emerges in these petty aggressions. So Mars itself as a whole is described as an almost fertile spiderweb of lines. The Senator Taft River is a sluggish and repellent green. It mentions that there are Jersey cows there that have been bent into something resembling their ancestors by the unjust environment. So Philip K. Dick, I think, is sceptical of the idea of space colonization, this idea of escaping Earth. And we should say within the novel, Earth is not perfect either. They've got a big problem with educated workforce, there's no jobs, pollution, and so on. Not so different today. So I suppose you can read that as somewhat negative or cynical, nihilistic even, or even as an insistence that we have to confront the problems, we cannot escape them. And indeed, within the book, the UN depicts as a very powerful organisation, as this kind of, I suppose it serves as an avatar for Earth's power within the book. And it's made quite clear in the novel, I think, that Earth has a power to shape the colony. That's something that repeated. People in this colony do have a lot of autonomy and power, but there's an idea that they only have it insofar as the Earth doesn't care about them. As soon as they want something changed and want to exercise some power, then the power of the colonists themselves will dissipate quite quickly. Also, in some ways, the colony reproduces the problems of Earth. So there's an alien race that lives on Mars called the Bleakmen, who are referred to by the N-word. So this is kind of a slave class. They had built the great canals that formerly lay on Mars and have now gone into ruin. It's not really explained why they no longer maintain those, or what happened to their civilization. But the inequality has been replicated, racism has been replicated. So again, there's this idea that you can't just escape your problems. These problems are replicated here in the colony. Arnie Cott, as the head of the plumbers union, has a racket which gives him the power to make it a utopia for himself in some regard. Like, he has these steam baths, and they do not collect the runoff water, which is like a gesture of decadence, like to kind of show his power. Inequalities reproduce, and it's a utopia for some and not for others, as we've on Earth and any other place. So I do think this idea of science as a kind of guarantor of some future utopia, or as a means of escaping our problems, is something that does need cutting down. I think when you think about Elon Musk talking about colonizing Mars or something, and you think about, I think in a sense that does perform a function which the colony is performing in this book, which is it's a symbol in some sense. It's a guarantor of a possibility of escape, or a possibility of a future exists. It exists in the colony. It's performing a kind of pacifying function back on Earth. So, for example, there is a camp there called Camp BG, a camp for anomalous children is the phrase it used. So these are people who've got some kind of mental problems, or mutations, physical disabilities, things like that. And they talk about them being like a defective stock, and they're thinking about closing the camp because, and you can probably imagine what would happen to the residents, because there's an explosion of mental illness on Earth, and they like to present the idea that the colony is kind of racially pure and doesn't have the same problems that exist on Earth. So it performs a kind of symbolic function. So if you're someone who's living on Earth and has to deal with the problems that are there on a daily basis, just the fact that the colony exists as a kind of idea, just because you know it's there, it gives the idea of a possibility of a future, a guarantee of a future, a possibility of escape that may not actually become accessible to you, but it performs a pacifying function in the fact that you know it's there. And I think that science does that in some regards. As I say, when I think about Elon Musk colonizing Mars, and the climate problems we face, and the idea that, well, is this idea in your mind that science will find a solution for climate change, or in a worst case scenario, then we can move on to another planet, so we don't really have to deal with the issues that we have. And indeed, I mean, someone like Elon Musk, I think, has achieved nothing, or very little at least. He's someone who talks about things, and I think there's something very sinister when you look at like his comments on public transport. You could see his contempt for ordinary people there quite easily. Contempt, I think, is quite indicative for a certain type of San Francisco tech person. He's someone who clearly doesn't get why public transport works and why it might be desirable. And yeah, indeed, like there's loads of these tech companies that want to undermine public transport because it's a new area for them for private revenue. It's a new area for profit. That's why very rich people continue to invest in Uber, despite the fact that Uber does not make any money. It's a loss-making business. But it continues to get huge amounts of venture capital because it undermines public transport, and that's why people continue to fund it. So yes, anyway, this idea of science and technology saving us is something that I think needs to be cut down. I think that's something there in Martian Time-Slip, where the colony and the idea of space exploration, space colonisation serves as kind of symbol of escape. And more generally, I think it's representative of a kind of more sceptical or critical era of sci-fi that you'd have in the 60s and 70s, moving out of the wide-eyed optimism of golden age science fiction. So there's kind of a dystopian move there in some sense, I suppose, which is interesting. Now I want to move on to talk about the school in Martian Time-Slip. This is quite an important place in terms of what it does to Jack, and it's something that keeps coming up in the story. So this is the place where Jack's son is educated. They don't have teachers, they have robots there that teach the children. The idea is that the machines can cater their teaching to each pupil because they won't confuse the pupil. They'll know what each one responds to. That's easy for a computer to record and memorize. Like the school, when Jack's at the school, he notes how it observes what he's doing when he's there. When he picks up a magazine, it knows what magazine he picks up. It notes how long he reads it for. It's kind of evaluating people and what they need. These teaching machines are all like historical figures, like, well, not all historical figures, but so there's like Aristotle, teaching machine, Abraham Lincoln, Kant, Mark Twain. There's also a janitor who like runs around the corridors waving his fist. He's described as being like an authority figure, and his purpose is to teach children to respect property. I mean, you can already sort of see the critique here, this idea that when you work in a system like this, you're in some sense an automaton that's performing a role that system needs to instill in the people that it's managing or producing, you might say, in the case of a school. And that's what the janitor performs this role, and that's the role he's expected to fulfill. You've also got figures like kindly dad. So yeah, you can think of roles in a school and people consciously or not playing these roles. Like this applies to any organisation, I think, but not just to schools. Like, we all know that there's like a teacher who's seen as the disciplinarian, and the kind teacher and so on, which I think that is in some ways obviously just reflective of the fact that people are different. But I think people do tend to play these roles. You've probably noticed that when you've been in different organisations or even just different social situations, like sometimes people behave slightly differently. Like you're in a certain role in that different situation or organisation, and you're expected to play it in some way. Yeah, so as I said, it doesn't need to be a school. It can be any organisation, a company, and within that, when you are playing that role, you're in some sense becoming an automaton, like a gear in that system, that machine. A quick aside, it's quite funny the way Philip K. Dick's these teaching units all have like gears and stuff in them. Philip K. Dick has a very analog vision of the future. His idea of like a futuristic computer is always like a huge tower with spools of tape. Like, he's actually quite bad, I think, at imagining as a futurist, but I think, as I suggested before, futurism is not what's interesting about science fiction. His idea is the interesting thing. But yeah, it's quite funny how he sees the future. But anyway, so I think what he's doing with the school, he's using the school to think about how society reproduces itself, like how it reproduces culture, how it reproduces ideology, how it reproduces the kind of citizens that it needs. So Jack when he's thinking about the role of the school, so he's thinking, well, it's not really to educate, it's to mould. And he says that the school peddled the human or earth culture to the young. He says it irons out their quirks. So obviously the idea that institutions are there to reproduce culture or in some way is nothing new. I mean, I'm not an expert on Foucault, but you might be familiar with Foucault writing about like prisons, schools, hospitals as being these kind of sites of discipline that produce a certain kind of population. So I think that's the same kind of critique that Philip K. Dick is trying to produce in this novel, particularly through the school. So he says that there is a battle in the school between the individual psyches of the children and the composite psyche of the school, which composite psyche of the school I think we kind of read as being society or like hegemonic ideology or something like that. It's kind of brought into focus how these institutions perform that role. You think of there's a scene with kindly dad who sits in a room with a fireplace, this kind of cozy room, and of course Jack points out that like there's no fireplaces on Mars, and this idea of his cozy place is completely alien to the children who would have grown up on Mars. It's an attempt to produce a fixed milieu from Earth, is what he says. So I think what this does, when we see this in the colony, the alien nature of this scenario to the kids who have brought up on Mars, which is a completely different place, it separates this kind of normality from it. It brings into focus the social reproductive functions of the school. So that's, I think, something that thinking about what sci-fi can do is the critical dystopian mode, I would say, is bring into focus things that might otherwise be invisible because they appear natural when they, of course, are not natural. And this placing like the functioning of the school in an alien context where bits of it therefore appear alien in this setting, you get a new perspective in which to see its functioning. So it's kind of a critical gesture. But anyway, So something else that the novel is quite concerned with is how these systems respond to people that don't fit in. Like, they don't tend to have flexibility. They have a tendency to force you to operate in the way they want you to, or you will be labelled as some kind of outcast, troublemaker, as ill, as a deviant. So there's a bit where Jack recalls the first schizophrenic episode he had on Earth. He has a recurrence of this when he is, at a time when he's visiting the school. I think it's significant that happens there, and he's always deeply uncomfortable there. Again, I think the school here is kind of an avatar for systems, the idea of a system and what happens when you don't fit in one. So he has this hallucination. When he's back on Earth, I'm talking about his first schizophrenic episode. He has this hallucination of this personnel manager that he meets as artificial, like the teachers, of course, who are literally artificial. And he says, in the book it says, he saw through the man's skin, his skeleton. It had been wired together, the bones connected with fine copper wire. The organs, which had withered away, were replaced by artificial components. Kidney, heart, lungs, everything was made of plastic and stainless steel, all working in unison, but entirely without authentic life. So this personnel manager that he sees in this way, the reason he is called in to see him is because he's not been cashing his checks. He says to him, why aren't you cashing your paychecks? He kind of goes on to say, like, you could stand a new suit and a haircut. So what's interesting is it's not even that he's doing anything wrong per se. He's doing his job. He's functioning. You might even think that a company would be pleased that he's not cashing his paychecks. But the thing is, he's not behaving as he's supposed to behave. He's not being normal. And that makes them uncomfortable. That is worthy of discipline. And you can quite tell that this guy, he is feigning concern about Jack, but it's really more an annoyance that he's not being normal. So I think you can read this as a concern about what institutions and society does more broadly, and how they create norms and the problems that you encounter when you do not follow that norm. And again, there's this idea of this guy being inhuman, like becoming, he says, without authentic life. So this guy is an avatar of the system. He is enacting the discipline of the system, so he is becoming inhuman. Once you start to perform that role, once you start to enforce the standards of the system on its behalf, you're kind of becoming inhuman. I think that's the idea that it's dealing with here. So this all ties into something else in the book, the subject of mental illness and psychiatry. I just want to say very quickly something on definitions. So I think understanding of what schizophrenia is has changed a lot, and Philip K. Dick's use of it is quite loose here and probably doesn't match the current definition. Also with Manfred, this child who is autistic, there's kind of a slippage between the idea of having autism and being psychotic in some way. Autism is literally described as being psychosis, which, I'm not an expert, but I think that's wrong. So just to say that we're working with old or incorrect definitions here, but I'm primarily just going to be using the definitions of the novel for ease sake, but just to say, yeah, obviously these are, I think, problematic, the way these slip between each other. But anyway, so I feel like I've read books before. It'd be great to give you some examples, but this is just kind of a vague recollection I have, where psychiatry is part of a utopia or gestured as being something that's important to utopia. I feel like Freud is something that's mentioned a lot in like 60s or 70s science fiction. You might have noticed, by the way, that Carl Jung has mentioned in both of the previous books we've covered on the podcast, which I didn't mention in the episode. But anyway, they have this idea that problems in our society are a result of our pathologies and neuroses, and the reason that people at the top in particular wage war and do all sorts of other psychopathic things is that they're mentally ill. There's this idea that if we analysed ourselves, if we were all subject to psychoanalysis, then we wouldn't be driven by our pathologies and we would have a better society. I wish I could remember exactly where I've read these things. It might be more from this kind of hippie, new agey, man, I don't know how to describe it. If you're familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, it might be from that kind of tradition more than science fiction. But I feel like I've seen it in a lot of science fiction. But anyway, there may be like something in that idea, but also you can take a more skeptical approach, which is what this book does when Jack is thinking about categorizations, and he says that the term autistic has replaced the term psychotic, which itself replaced the term moral imbecile, which replaced the term criminally insane, and so on and so on. And he says that this is a self-serving concept for the Mars authorities. This idea of you can label people who don't fit or don't behave as you want in such a way that you're empowered to remove them or discipline them in some way. So this idea that psychiatry can be a means to exercise power is something that this would have been talked about. There was an anti-psychiatry movement in the 60s, people like R.D. Laing and David Cooper. I don't know if Philip K. Dick was aware of those, but he was pretty well read by all accounts, so it's certainly possible that he did. And there is a history in psychiatry which you can find of psychiatry and, again, labelling of people being used in this way as an exercise of power. For example, you think of the way it's been used to reinforce gender roles. You look at how electroshock therapy was being used on women in particular because, I don't know, they had some kind of sexual drive or they didn't want to do a particular thing. They wanted to do things that would be considered quite reasonable and normal by today's standards, but at that time, they were able to be diagnosed as hysterical or whatever else. That's feel like that's the common one that seems to be have been used, particularly when it comes to women as a categorization. And then they could be institutionalized, have electroshock therapy on them, whatever, to try and make them conform. So yeah, this obviously goes back to school and people who don't behave as they should and so on. Psychiatry functions in quite a weird way in this novel, actually. Quite an amusing way in some regards, I suppose, where psychiatrists don't actually cure their patients. They stand in for them instead and take on their social obligations. So the way that the book describes schizophrenia, which again may be completely wrong, so I don't know, but it's described as basically being about an inability to deal with society and social norms and its obligations, the pressures it puts on you. And there's as I say, there's an epidemic of schizophrenia in this book, particularly on Earth. So what this psychiatrist does in the book, Milton Glaub, there's a scene where there's a guy who comes to him, he's getting a party thrown for him because his family want him to take on his nephew as an apprentice, and they're kind of throwing this party as a thank you, which he doesn't actually want to do it. So Milton Glaub agrees to go for him and basically tell them that he doesn't want to do it. He will stand in for him. And he says, I'll take your social pressure for you. Or he thinks, rather, I'll take your social pressure for you and you can continue in your chronic maladaptive state, at least for another few months until the next overpowering social demand is made on your limited capabilities. Anyway, going back to Jack's outbreak of schizophrenia and the way that the book is using the school to explore the idea of society's pressure and how it creates individuals. There's a question, I think, in the book as to whether Jack is psychotic or in some way society's pressure for him to adjust is the thing that's actually psychotic. So taking that a bit further or clarifying that, I suppose, if you look at the actions of the powerful people in this book, like Jack's dad is a property speculator. Jack kind of finds this morally disgusting, like the way he exploits his knowledge to make money in a way that will ultimately harm lots of people. Arnie Cott, he is paranoid. He has a tendency to see things that go against him quite accidentally, often as a personal attack, and he has these kind of obsessive quests for vengeance, like he will get people that go against him. He's kind of a tyrant in that respect. So there's a quote I've got here from a book called Philip K. Dick, The Exhilaration and Terror of the Postmodern, written by a guy called Christopher Palmer, where he sums up what's happening here quite nicely, I think. He says that the book suggests that the socially powerful are more dangerous since prevailing ideology both encourages their destructive power and blinds them to their own condition than those who are labelled insane and rendered powerless. So I think that's quite a nice quote and nicely encapsulates what I've been trying to say, the structure of the world that Jack lives in and the one that he's escaped from Earth, the ideology of capitalism, the institutions there encourage a destructive behaviour which is rendered normal through these institutions and social structures, this kind of dangerous behaviour. And it's able to label people who are in reality much less of a threat as being the dangerous ones that need to be disciplined or removed in some way. Another thing that's going on with the way the book deals with mental health problems is this idea that those problems can give you access to other realities, other modes of perception. So Manfred it's open, left open with the book in some extent, whether Manfred can see the future or he has some kind of power to shape the future with his vision. There's a suggestion that Jack perhaps has some kind of precognitive ability too through his mental illness. And going back to the anti-psychiatry movement I was talking about, one of the criticisms that it faced was that it glorified mental illness, and there were different strands within that movement, but there were people who wanted to abolish psychiatry entirely and who would say that if you had some kind of mental health problem, that you just had to not conform to psychiatry and take yourself out of that. If you were going to cure yourself and you didn't really have a problem and psychiatry was convincing you had a problem, that kind of thing. So which is obviously very dangerous for people who are suffering from, depression or whatever, any other mental health issues and do need help. What I would say is that with this book, though I think Philip K. Dick is critiquing psychiatry as how it can be used as a means of exercising power, and he does present mental illness as perhaps giving access to enhanced perception in some way. It definitely does not glorify it. So Manfred's visions are hell. They're dominated by this vision of him in the future being kept alive in a nursing home full of mechanical enhancements that are just there to keep him existing. His visions are incredibly unpleasant. They're full of imagery of rotting flesh and decaying things and maggots and other such bodily horror. He has this degenerative vision of the universe where everything is gubbish, is the phrase that he repeats in the book, where everything's decaying. This vision infects Jack's perception and it infects the texture of the novel. So there's a bit, for example, where the events go kind of out of sequence and they start to repeat themselves. It's not clear what is reality and what is a vision. So there's an idea that we experience this literal horror of the visions, but also the existential terror of the boundaries between reality and hallucination or fantasy, whatever you want to call it, blurring and then not knowing where we are. That's also Jack's visions as well. Clearly, they are a hell for him. His mental illness is the thing that terrifies him the most. It's crippling. It's all-encompassing. So, yeah, certainly this book does not glorify mental illness. So I think it strikes quite a nice balance there in critiquing psychiatry without going too far in the other direction and glorifying mental illness in some way. So just to close, I think, with a few very quick thoughts about the book's utopian dimensions, some of which we've already covered, I would say, but it's worth saying Manfred does find an escape. He finds a way to avert his vision. So he escapes the prophecy, which I think is a utopian gesture. Always this idea that even when you're on a path that is likely in some way, then that can still be diverted. And in this case, like the hell that Manfred sees, I think is in some way, it's a hell also for Jack. I won't go into explaining why that is because it's gone on long enough, but this future that he sees, what it brings to Mars is what Jack tried to escape. In some way, I think it's a hell for Philip K. Dick, this view of society. And again, these things we've been talking about with the way its systems function, the way those systems are on Earth, the way they're coming to Mars. So the fact that vision has escaped is in a way a utopian vision about being able to change that and escape that. So I think I'll leave it there. There's probably more to say, but I've gone on for long enough. And hopefully I've touched on some of the more interesting aspects of the book. Thank you very much for listening to this. Oh, thank you to Dan. I noticed you on Twitter recommending the podcast to somebody else. That's very much appreciated. So cheers for that. If anyone else would like to recommend this podcast to someone they know who they think might like it, that would be very much appreciated. iTunes reviews would be good as well, as I always say, but that doesn't work. Nobody gives me any. The next episode of the podcast will be on the film. The name I have forgotten. I could just edit this out, but I'll just Google it. What's it called? Nemesis, I think. Yes, Nemesis, the 1992 film. The next Philip K. Dick episode, should you want to read the next book ahead of time, will be The Simulacra, a book which I've read but can't remember at all, so that'll be interesting. And I will mention before the end of the podcast, if you want to contribute a little bit of money to the podcast to help me to keep doing it, you can do that at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons. Get in touch with me about the thing I mentioned at the beginning of the episode about possibly starting a Discord or a Slack if you've got an opinion on that, or if you, I don't know, it might be even helpful to know if you've got no interest in that and think it's a bad idea. So tweet me at Utopian Horizons, email me utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com. And I think I've said everything I need to say. So thank you for listening, and I will be back in a couple of weeks, probably with another episode.